Hello everyone. I'm the storyteller and I'm here to help you tonight. I know many of you listen to these stories as you drift off to sleep, so before we begin, take a deep breath, settle into your pillows, and let your eyes get heavy. If you're watching this late at night, you're not alone. You're here now with me, so relax and listen closely. The Lighthouse Keeper's Dream. The fog rolled in from the Atlantic like a living thing, soft and gray and endless, wrapping around the small coastal town of Beacon's Rest with gentle fingers that seemed to stroke the weathered buildings and quiet streets. Alina watched from the window of the harbormaster's office as the mist swallowed the fishing boats one by one, their masts disappearing into the gray embrace like memories fading at the edge of sleep. "Strange weather for September," murmured Captain Morrison, his voice barely above a whisper in the thick silence that had settled over the harbor. He was an old man with kind eyes and hands that moved slowly, deliberately, as if he had learned the value of taking time with everything. "Fog's been coming in heavier each night, staying longer each morning." Alina nodded, though her attention was drawn inexorably to the lighthouse that stood on the rocky promontory at the mouth of the harbor. Even through the thickening mist, its white tower gleamed like a beacon of calm in the gray world. She had been watching it since arriving in town 3 days ago, drawn to it by something she couldn't quite name, a pull that felt like homesickness for a place she had never been. "The position's still open, you know," Captain Morrison said softly, following her gaze. "Old Henrik passed last month. Heart gave out in his sleep, peaceful as you please. Been trying to find someone willing to tend the light ever since." The words seemed to hang in the air like the fog outside, heavy with possibility. Alina had come to Beacon's Rest on a whim, driving north from the city when the noise and rush and constant demands had become too much to bear. She had intended to stay only a few days, long enough to clear her head and decide what to do with her life. But something about the town had wrapped around her like a warm blanket, making her reluctant to leave. "What does it involve?" she heard herself asking, though she hadn't planned to speak. Captain Morrison's smile was slow and warm. "Simple work, really. Keep the light burning, tend the quarters, log the weather. Island's got everything you need: generator for power, radio for emergencies, supplies delivered monthly. Mostly, though, it's just peaceful, good place for thinking, good place for resting." The way he said the word resting made it sound like something sacred, something precious beyond measure. Alina felt her eyelids growing heavy just thinking about it, imagining herself in the lighthouse keeper's cottage, surrounded by the gentle sound of waves and the soft whisper of fog. "The pay's not much," Captain Morrison continued, "but you wouldn't need much out there. House is furnished, utilities included. Mostly what you get is solitude and the most beautiful sunrises you've ever seen. Well, when the fog lifts enough to see them." Alina found herself nodding before she fully realized she had made the decision. "When could I start?" By evening she was standing at the end of the town's small pier, waiting for the boat that would take her to Gull's Rest Island. Her few possessions, a suitcase of clothes, some books, her laptop, sat beside her in a pile that looked impossibly small for an entire life. But then she reflected drowsily. Perhaps she had been carrying too much baggage anyway. The fog had thickened as the sun set, turning the world into a cocoon of gray silence. Sounds became muffled and distant: the gentle lap of water against the pier pilings, the soft cry of seabirds settling for the night, the barely audible hum of the town's few streetlights glowing like dim stars in the mist. Captain Morrison emerged from the fog like a ghost, piloting a small motorboat with movements that seemed more felt than seen. His presence was comforting in the gray emptiness, solid and real and reassuring. "Ready?" he asked softly, and Alina nodded, allowing him to help her into the boat with hands that were surprisingly gentle for their weathered appearance. The journey to the island took on a dreamlike quality in the fog. Alina could see nothing beyond the small circle of dark water immediately around the boat, yet she felt no fear, only a deep sense of peace that seemed to seep into her bones like warm honey. The motor's gentle puttering was hypnotic, and she found herself nodding off repeatedly, only to jerk awake when a wave rocked the boat or a seabird called from somewhere in the gray void. "There she is," Captain Morrison murmured, and Alina looked up to see the lighthouse materializing out of the fog like something from a dream. The beacon was already lit, its beams sweeping across the water in slow, measured intervals that seemed timed to the rhythm of her own breathing. The white tower rose into the mist like a finger pointing toward heaven, and at its base, she could just make out the dark bulk of the keeper's cottage. The small dock was old but solid, its weathered planks slick with moisture from the fog. Captain Morrison helped her onto the pier and carried her belongings up the narrow path that wound between sea-carved rocks and patches of beach grass that whispered secrets in the gentle breeze. "Henrik kept the place in good order," he said as they approached the cottage. "You shouldn't want for anything. Radios in the lighthouse if you need to call the mainland. Automatic timer keeps the light going, but it's good to check on it each evening just to be sure." The cottage was small but perfectly appointed, with thick stone walls that promised warmth and security against any storm. The windows were deep-set and cozy, their sills wide enough to sit on while watching the sea. Inside, everything was clean and comfortable. A sitting room with a stone fireplace and built-in bookshelves, a compact kitchen with a view of the harbor, a bedroom tucked under the eaves with a bed that looked impossibly inviting. "Henrik was a reader," Captain Morrison said, gesturing to the shelves that lined nearly every wall. "Left quite a collection. Lots of poetry, philosophy, books about the sea. Good company for quiet evenings." Alina ran her fingers along the spines of the books, feeling an immediate sense of belonging. These were books that invited slow reading, contemplation, the kind of deep engagement that required time and peace and perfect stillness. She could already imagine herself curled in the armchair by the fireplace, reading by lamplight while the fog pressed against the windows like a gentle hand. Captain Morrison showed her the lighthouse itself, a spiral staircase that wound up through the center of the tower, past storage rooms and equipment, to the lantern room at the top. The lens was massive and beautiful, cut crystal that caught and magnified the light into something that seemed almost alive. The beam swept across the water with mechanical precision, but there was something organic about it too, something that seemed to breathe with the rhythm of the sea itself. "She'll mostly take care of herself," Captain Morrison said. "Just needs someone to keep an eye on things, make sure everything's running smooth. Weather station's up here too, temperature, barometric pressure, wind speed. Coastal Guard likes to get reports twice a day, but it's all automated mostly. Your job is just to be here, really. To tend the light and tend yourself." After Captain Morrison left, his boat disappearing into the fog like a ghost returning to the spirit world, Alina found herself alone on the island for the first time. The silence was profound but not empty. It was filled with the gentle sounds of the sea, the whisper of wind through the rocks, the soft rotation of the lighthouse beam overhead. She stood on the cottage's small porch and breathed in air that tasted of salt and fog and something else, something that reminded her of childhood summers and peaceful dreams. The cottage seemed to welcome her with warmth that had nothing to do with temperature. Every surface was soft with age and use, worn smooth by the hands of previous keepers, who had found the same peace she was already beginning to feel. The armchair by the fireplace seemed molded to fit her body perfectly, and the bed upstairs was so comfortable she felt herself sinking into it like water finding its level. That first night, Alina slept more deeply than she had in years. The lighthouse beam swept across her bedroom window at regular intervals, painting the walls with brief moments of soft light that felt like blessings. The sound of the waves was hypnotic, and she found herself breathing in rhythm with their gentle rhythm, her heartbeat slowing to match the pulse of the sea. She dreamed of the island, but not as she had seen it in daylight. In her dream, the fog had lifted, revealing a landscape of impossible beauty. The rocks were covered with gardens of sea flowers that glowed with their own inner light. Other lighthouses stood on distant islands, their beams creating a network of light across the dark water. And walking among the gardens were figures in flowing white robes, tending the flowers with movements that were slow and graceful and infinitely peaceful. Alina woke feeling more rested than she could remember being in her adult life. The fog still pressed against the windows, but it no longer seemed like a barrier. Instead, it felt like a soft blanket that protected the island from the harsh world beyond. She made coffee in the small kitchen and took it out to the porch, where she sat in a wooden chair that seemed designed for watching the sea and thinking deep thoughts. The days that followed blended together in a haze of perfect contentment. Alina fell into a routine that felt as natural as breathing. She would wake when her body told her to wake, eat when she was hungry, read when the mood struck her, and spend long hours simply sitting and watching the fog shift and flow around the island like a living thing. The lighthouse required little attention. The mechanism was old but reliable, and the automated systems handled most of the work. Alina's job was mainly to observe and record, to be present as a guardian of the light. She found this responsibility deeply satisfying in a way that her previous career in marketing had never been. Here, her work had meaning that went beyond profit margins and quarterly reports. She was keeping ships safe, maintaining a beacon of hope in the darkness. The fog rarely lifted completely, but it would thin sometimes, revealing glimpses of the mainland or other islands in the distance. During these brief clearings, Alina would see fishing boats making their way through the channels, their crews waving to the lighthouse as they passed. She would wave back from her position on the catwalk around the lantern room, feeling connected to the ancient tradition of lighthouse keepers who had guided mariners safely home for centuries. But it was during the thick fog that Alina felt most at peace. The gray mist created a world that was entirely her own, a cocoon of silence and soft light where time moved at its own pace. She would spend hours walking the island's small paths, discovering tide pools filled with sea anemones that waved like underwater flowers, finding sheltered coves where the water was so still it looked like dark glass. The cottage became more familiar and comfortable with each passing day. Alina arranged her few belongings among Henrik's possessions, and they seemed to blend naturally, as if she had always lived there. She read his books slowly and carefully, lingering over passages that spoke to her soul. Many of them were about solitude and contemplation, about finding peace in simple things and learning to appreciate the beauty of quiet moments. One book in particular captured her attention, a journal written by a lighthouse keeper from the 1890s. His entries were brief but profound, observations about the sea and the weather, and the profound satisfaction of tending the light. As Alina read, she felt a deep connection to this man who had stood in the same lantern room, watched the same patterns of waves and fog, found the same peace in the simple routine of lighthouse keeping. The fog came in thick tonight, one entry read, wrapping the island like a mother's embrace. In such weather, the world shrinks to just what is necessary: the light, the sea, the steady rhythm of waves against stone. Everything else falls away, leaving only the essential truth of being present in this moment, in this place. Alina found herself writing in her own journal, documenting not just the weather and the condition of the light, but her own gradual transformation. She was sleeping better than she had in years, eating simple meals that tasted better than the finest restaurant food, and discovering a capacity for contentment that she had forgotten she possessed. The constant anxiety that had plagued her in the city was fading like fog before sunrise, replaced by a deep sense of rightness about her place in the world. The island itself seemed to encourage this transformation. There was something about the rhythm of life there, governed by tides and weather rather than clocks and calendars, that brought her into harmony with natural cycles she had lost touch with during her years in the city. She found herself waking with the dawn even when fog hid the sun, growing tired as darkness fell even when artificial light could extend the day indefinitely. The lighthouse beam became her companion, sweeping across the water with reliable precision. Alina would sometimes climb to the lantern room just to watch it work, mesmerized by the rotation of the massive lens and the way it gathered and focused light into something powerful enough to reach across miles of dark water. There was something almost hypnotic about it, and she would often find herself standing there for hours, her breathing synchronized with the rhythm of the beacon's revolution. Visitors were rare, but when supply boats came from the mainland, Alina found herself reluctant to engage in conversation. The voices of the delivery crews seemed too loud, too urgent, carrying the frantic energy of the world she had left behind. She would accept her supplies with polite gratitude and then retreat to the cottage, waiting for the boats to disappear back into the fog before venturing out again. The island's solitude was not lonely. It was complete. Alina felt more connected to the world around her than she had when surrounded by thousands of people in the city. She was part of the ecosystem of sea and sky and stone, integrated into the ancient rhythm of lighthouse keeping that stretched back generations. She was maintaining something essential, something that transcended her individual concerns and connected her to every keeper who had ever tended a beacon on a dark shore. Her dreams grew more vivid and elaborate with each passing night. The figures in white robes appeared more frequently, tending their impossible gardens and moving through landscapes that seemed to exist in multiple dimensions at once. Sometimes she would dream that she was flying above the sea, looking down at a network of lighthouses that stretched to the horizon, each one tended by a keeper who had found the same peace she was discovering. Alina began to understand that the fog was not just weather. It was a presence, a conscious entity that protected the island and its keeper from the harsh intrusions of the modern world. During the thickest fogs, she would sometimes see shapes moving in the mist, tall figures that walked among the rocks with purposeful grace. They never came close enough for her to see clearly, but their presence was comforting rather than frightening, like guardians watching over the island and its light. The rhythm of her days became increasingly meditative. Alina would rise with the natural light filtering through the fog, spend the morning walking the island's perimeter, read during the afternoon while sitting by the cottage windows, and climb to the lantern room each evening to ensure the light was burning bright. Between these activities, she would find herself simply sitting and being, experiencing a depth of peace that she had never imagined possible. The books in Henrik's collection began to reveal deeper meanings as Alina's state of mind grew more contemplative. Poetry that had once seemed abstract now spoke directly to her experience of solitude and connection with the natural world. Philosophy texts that had been intellectually interesting became guides for living, offering insights into the nature of consciousness and the value of simplicity. One rainy afternoon, though rain and fog were so similar on the island that the distinction was meaningless, Alina discovered a locked drawer in Henrik's desk. The key was hanging on a small hook inside the desk's main drawer, as if Henrik had wanted it to be found, but only by someone who had settled into the cottage's rhythms enough to explore thoroughly. Inside the drawer was another journal, older and more worn than the others. The handwriting was different from the Victorian lighthouse keeper's journal she had been reading. This one was Henrik's own record of his years on the island, and as Alina read, she realized that her predecessor had undergone the same transformation she was experiencing. 3 months now since I came to the island, one entry read, and I am beginning to understand what Captain Morrison meant when he said this was a place for resting. Not just physical rest, though I sleep better here than I have since childhood, but a deeper kind of rest, a cessation of the constant striving and worrying that marked my years on the mainland. The fog helps, creating a buffer between this place and the world of deadlines and demands. Later entries documented Henrik's growing connection to the island and its mysterious properties. He wrote about the figures in the fog, the dreams of otherworldly gardens, the sense of being part of something larger and more ancient than individual human consciousness. His words resonated with Alina's own experience so perfectly that she sometimes felt he was writing about her life rather than his own. The lighthouse is more than a navigation aid, Henrik wrote in one of his final entries, dated just weeks before his death. It is a beacon between worlds, a bridge between the mundane and the sacred. Those who are called to tend it are not chosen randomly. We are selected by the island itself, drawn here by forces we barely understand but which serve a purpose greater than our own small concerns. Alina closed the journal with trembling hands and climbed to the lantern room, where she stood looking out into the fog that surrounded the island like a protective embrace. The lighthouse beam swept across the water with its steady rhythm, and she felt a deep understanding of her role here. She was not just keeping ships safe from the rocks. She was maintaining something essential about the nature of peace itself, holding space for a way of being that the modern world had largely forgotten. That night her dreams were more vivid than ever. She found herself walking through the same garden she had seen in previous dreams, but now she was not alone. Other figures moved among the glowing flowers, and as they turned to face her, she recognized them. Lighthouse keepers from across the centuries, all connected by their shared service to the beacon and their discovery of the profound peace that came with true solitude. Henrik was there, looking younger and more vibrant than she imagined he had in life. He smiled at her with infinite kindness and gestured toward a section of the garden where new flowers were just beginning to bloom. Alina understood without words that this was her contribution to the eternal garden, the peace she was cultivating through her service to the light. The Victorian keeper was there too, along with others stretching back through history. Men and women who had answered the same call she had answered, who had found the same refuge from the world's harshness in the simple act of tending a beacon on a rocky shore. They welcomed her into their eternal community with gestures of warmth and acceptance that needed no words. Alina woke from these dreams feeling more rested and centered than ever. The fog outside her windows seemed brighter, more luminous, as if lit from within by its own gentle radiance. She began to notice that the mist moved in patterns that seemed almost intentional, creating shapes and formations that shifted like slow dancers performing an ancient ritual. Her days took on an increasingly ceremonial quality. Every action, lighting the oil lamps in the cottage when the generator ran low, recording weather observations, maintaining the lighthouse equipment, became a form of meditation, a conscious participation in the ancient tradition of lighthouse keeping. She moved more slowly and deliberately, finding that each task performed with full attention became a source of deep satisfaction. The island seemed to respond to her growing integration into its rhythms. Flowers appeared in rocky crevices where she had never noticed them before, sea pinks and wild roses that bloomed despite the constant fog and salt spray. Seabirds became less wary of her presence, allowing her to sit quietly among them while they preened, and called to each other in voices that seemed to carry messages she almost understood. Alina's connection to the mainland world continued to fade. She rarely used the radio except for required weather reports, and when she did speak to Captain Morrison during his monthly supply runs, her voice seemed to come from a great distance, as if she were speaking across vast expanses of time as well as space. The concerns and anxieties that had once dominated her thoughts seemed increasingly irrelevant, like problems from someone else's life. The fog became her closest companion, wrapping around the island with what felt like conscious affection. Alina learned to read its moods and patterns, understanding when it would lift enough to reveal glimpses of the surrounding sea, and when it would thicken into an impenetrable wall that made the island feel like the only solid thing in a world of gray dreams. During the thickest fogs, Alina would sometimes see the other lighthouse keepers more clearly. They moved through the mist with the same slow, purposeful grace she was developing, tending to tasks that seemed both practical and ritualistic. Sometimes they would nod to her in passing, acknowledging her as a fellow guardian of the light, a keeper of the peace that the beacon represented. Alina's journal entries grew shorter and more poetic as the weeks passed. The practical concerns of weather and equipment gave way to observations about the quality of light, the patterns of the fog, the deep satisfaction of living in harmony with natural rhythms. Her handwriting became more flowing and graceful, as if her thoughts were slowing down to match the island's peaceful pace. "The fog lifted briefly this morning," she wrote, "revealing the mainland like a distant memory. I felt no longing to return, only gratitude for the veil that protects this sanctuary from the world's harsh demands. The lighthouse beam reaches across the water like a bridge between worlds, offering guidance to those who are ready to receive it." The seasonal changes on the island were subtle but profound. Alina noticed that the fog took on different qualities as autumn deepened into winter, sometimes silver, sometimes pearl gray, sometimes touched with the faintest hint of blue or gold. The patterns of the waves changed too, becoming more rhythmic and hypnotic as storm seasons approached. But the island seemed to exist in its own microclimate, protected from the worst weather by forces that Alina was beginning to understand were not entirely natural. The fog acted as a buffer, absorbing the energy of storms and transforming them into gentle mist that caressed the rocks rather than battering them. Alina's routine adapted to these seasonal rhythms without conscious effort. She found herself sleeping longer during the short winter days, staying awake later during the endless twilight of the fog-shrouded evenings. Her body seemed to be attuning itself to cycles that had nothing to do with clocks or calendars, aligning instead with the deep rhythms of the sea and the ancient pulse of the lighthouse beam. The cottage grew more comfortable with each passing day, as if it were gradually molding itself to her presence. Chairs seemed to adjust to her body, windows opened exactly wide enough to let in the perfect amount of sea air, and the fireplace drew perfectly no matter which way the wind was blowing. Alina began to suspect that the building itself was alive in some way, conscious and responsive to the needs of its keeper. Her dreams continued to grow more elaborate and meaningful. The garden she visited in sleep was expanding, with new sections appearing each night. She began to understand that each lighthouse keeper contributed something unique to this eternal landscape. Henrik had cultivated roses that bloomed in impossible colors. The Victorian keeper had grown trees that bore fruit made of crystallized starlight, and Alina was beginning to tend flowers that sang with voices like wind chimes. The boundary between dreaming and waking continued to blur. Alina would find herself tending the dream garden while fully conscious, her hands moving through empty air as she watered plants that existed in dimensions beyond the physical. These moments felt completely natural, as if she were simply expanding her awareness to include levels of reality that most people never perceived. The lighthouse beam became increasingly significant in these experiences. Alina understood that it was not just illuminating the physical sea, but also casting light into the dream realm, creating a connection between the everyday world and the garden, where all the lighthouse keepers met in eternal communion. Each night, as she climbed to the lantern room to check the light, she felt herself becoming more integrated into this network of guardians who tended beacons across multiple dimensions of existence. Her meals became simpler and more satisfying. Alina found that she needed less food but enjoyed it more, eating slowly and mindfully while watching the fog patterns shift outside her windows. Simple bread and tea became feasts when consumed with full attention, and she began to understand what the mystics meant when they spoke of finding the sacred in ordinary moments. The island's wildlife seemed to accept her as a permanent resident. Seals would bask on the rocks near the cottage without showing any fear, and seabirds would perch on the lighthouse railings while she performed her evening checks. Sometimes she would sit among them in perfect silence, feeling herself part of the ecosystem that the island supported across multiple levels of reality. Alina's sense of time became increasingly fluid. Days might feel like weeks when the fog was particularly thick and dreamlike, or weeks might pass like single afternoons when she was deeply absorbed in reading or contemplation. The lighthouse beam provided the only consistent measure of time's passage, marking the hours with its steady rotation, while everything else flowed according to its own mysterious logic. The radio reports she was required to make became increasingly difficult. The language of weather measurements and technical specifications seemed foreign to her now, inadequate to describe the reality of living in harmony with forces that transcended simple meteorology. Alina found herself struggling to translate her experience into terms that the mainland authorities would understand, feeling like she was trying to describe color to someone who had never seen. Captain Morrison noticed the change during his monthly visits. Alina had become more ethereal, more present and absent at the same time. She moved with the same slow grace as the fog itself, and her eyes held depths that seemed to reflect the eternal rather than the temporal. He was not surprised. He had seen the same transformation in other keepers over the years, and he understood that it was part of the island's gift to those who were ready to receive it. "You're settling in well," he observed during one visit, watching Alina move through the cottage with the fluid grace of someone who belonged there completely. "I am home," Alina replied simply, and Captain Morrison nodded with the understanding of someone who had facilitated many such homecomings over his years of service to the lighthouse. The fog grew thicker as winter deepened, sometimes so dense that Alina could barely see from the cottage to the lighthouse. But she navigated these conditions with increasing ease, her feet finding the familiar paths automatically while her mind dwelt in realms of peace and contemplation. The physical world was becoming just one layer of a reality that included much more than what ordinary senses could perceive. Alina's journal entries became increasingly abstract and poetic, documenting experiences that could barely be captured in words. She wrote about the music of the fog, the conversations she had with previous lighthouse keepers during her dream visits to the Eternal Garden, and the growing sense that her individual identity was dissolving into something larger and more beautiful. I am beginning to understand, she wrote, that the lighthouse is not just a building but a state of consciousness, a way of being in the world that offers guidance through the darkness of ordinary existence. Those who are called to serve here are not just tending a light, we are becoming light, transforming our individual awareness into something that can reach across the darkness to touch other souls who are lost in the fog of modern Ether. The lighthouse beam continued its steady rotation, but Alina noticed that its light was growing brighter and more penetrating. She realized that this was not a mechanical improvement, but a reflection of her own growing luminosity, her increasing integration into the network of consciousness that the lighthouse represented. She was becoming one with the light she tended, transforming from its keeper into its embodiment. The fog embraced the island more completely as winter reached its depth, creating a cocoon of gray silence that made the lighthouse feel like the only solid thing in a world of dreams. Alina moved through this environment with perfect ease. Her consciousness expanded to include the entire island and its surrounding waters. She was no longer just visiting the dream garden in her sleep. She was living there always, tending flowers that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously. The cottage, the lighthouse, the rocky shores, all of it was becoming translucent, like solid things seen through water or fog. Alina understood that this was not decay but transformation, a gradual shift from the merely physical to something that included but transcended ordinary matter. The island was revealing its true nature as a place between worlds, a sanctuary where those who were ready could transition to a more luminous way of being. Her final journal entry, written in handwriting that seemed to glow with its own inner light, captured the essence of her transformation. The fog has lifted, revealing not the harsh world I left behind but the garden that has always existed beneath the surface of ordinary perception. I am no longer the keeper of the lighthouse. I am the lighthouse, casting light across the waters of consciousness for those who are ready to find their way home. The beacon burns eternal, tended by all who have discovered the profound peace of serving something greater than themselves. Captain Morrison found the journal months later, when he came to check on the lighthouse after Alina had stopped responding to radio calls. The cottage was empty but somehow still occupied, filled with a presence that was warm and welcoming but no longer entirely human. The lighthouse beam continued its steady rotation, brighter than ever, casting light that seemed to reach far beyond the physical horizon. The island had claimed another keeper, transformed another soul from the frantic world of individual striving into the eternal community of those who tend the light between worlds. In the fog that perpetually surrounded Gull's Rest Island, those who looked carefully could sometimes see a figure moving with slow grace among the rocks, ensuring that the beacon continued to burn for all who needed guidance through the darkness. Alina had found her home at last, not just in the lighthouse cottage, but in the vast network of consciousness that connected all who had chosen service over self, peace over urgency, light over darkness. The fog wrapped around the island like a mother's embrace, protecting the sanctuary where transformation was always possible for those who were ready to let go of everything unnecessary and embrace the essential truth of being present in the eternal now. The lighthouse beam swept across the water with perfect regularity, a metronome of hope in the darkness, tended by keepers who had learned that the greatest service was simply to be present, to hold space for the light that guides all souls safely home through the fog of ordinary existence to the garden, where peace blooms eternal in dimensions beyond the reach of time.